In this wrap-up section, we're going to bring it all together, and I'm going to introduce one other tool that you can use. It's called a decision analysis tool. And we're going to look at it retrospectively. So I'm going to ask you to practice doing it with decisions that you've made in the past. But once you get really good at doing that, you can begin to do it going forward. And you can look at decisions you're making and saying, am I making this in concert with and a full understanding of my interests, my strengths, and my needs? So what you do with this tool is you take a decision that you're making and you put it in this triangle, the decision box. And then you label out on the side the various options that you had. I'll give you an example in a minute. So this is the one you chose, this is the one you didn't choose. And then you look at what you were conscious of when you were making the decision and whether that was an interest or a strength or a need. And then you look at the result and say, was I happy, was I successful, or was I understood? So let's take an example. This is from my own career journey. So when I was in graduate school, I graduated, I studied mathematics, and it was my full intention to get my PhD in mathematics. You saw earlier that I have an affinity for numbers. But when I was in graduate school, I was working on my master's, and I had to make a decision whether I was going to go down a theoretical path or an applied path in terms of mathematics. Now, I made that decision based on, in retrospect, based on some understanding of my interests, my strengths, and my needs. I knew that I really liked to deal with conceptual stuff. I knew that I really liked to ask why a lot, and that played more to the theoretical bent than it did to the applied bent. I knew in terms of my strengths that I was much better off if I could spend a significant amount of time working alone or in the company of one or two people. That played to my strengths. And I knew that I needed to have a steady pace of action where I could set my own schedule. I knew all of that, and I knew that the theoretical path played to that. The result of that decision was that I was happy, I was successful. In fact, I finished faster than most people did, and my master's thesis went on to become a published work in the field. And I experienced almost no stress in that year. In fact, that was one of the happiest years that I've had until 30 years later. Now let's look at another decision that I made right after I got my master's. So I was looking, as I said, to go on and get my PhD in academia. But I looked around, I did a market scan at that time, and it's hard to believe, but the market was flooded. And there were a lot of PhD mathematicians at the time that were waiting on tables while they were waiting to get academic appointments. It was a very uncertain time for them. That didn't play very well to my needs, and I didn't think that I needed to get a PhD in math if what I was going to do was to wait on tables. I also had a need for money. I had a real need for the security that comes from having a steady income and not having to worry about how the bills are going to get paid. So I was very conscious that I was making the decision based upon those needs. And I chose to go and get an engineering operations job as opposed to going on to getting my PhD in academia, because I was dealing with that one central need around security and a steady income. What was the result? I wasn't happy. I wasn't particularly successful. I can assure you that I was not understood by my mostly male but very technical, hands-on engineering colleagues. That was one of the least happy times in my life. Had I known about interest, strengths, and needs, I probably would have come up with a different option. And I probably would have done something waiting until the time changed, because working in academia, teaching, researching, that plays very, very well to my strengths. So an option that might have worked better for me in that situation was to teach, perhaps at the high school level. I actually considered briefly teaching in the Navy's Nuclear Propulsion School in Orlando, Florida. That would have been a much better choice as well. But I learned from that. So here's what I want you to take away from this workshop. The more you're able to devote time to your passions and avoid your aversions, the happier you're likely to be in your job. The more you are able to capitalize on your strengths, the happier you're going to be in your job, and the more likely you are to be successful. And a premise for both of those, what is really important is that your motivational needs are met. Because if they aren't, that will tend to be the basis upon which you will focus, just like I did in this decision, was focusing on getting that one motivational need met. You'll focus on that at the expense of working towards spending sufficient time on your passions and capitalizing on your strengths. So, in review, the goal is that you are happy, successful, and understood. There are 3 personality components that play into that: your interests, your strengths, and your needs. And there's a relatively simple process that you can go about to get clarity on that. Get a little kernel of information about you in each one of those areas. Go test it with someone who knows you well, and then begin to take action on it, but only action that you've tested with someone who knows you well. So I hope this has been of benefit to you, and I wish you nothing but happiness, success, and bliss in your career going forward.